Okay, so thank you all for making it. We're back to school. The new semester is about to start. I know it's an exciting time for us here at SAIS, as classes are beginning, I think, this week. So, and the world also is facing all kinds of challenges that I'm looking forward to discussing in the context of this BPAR seminar series, of which this panel is a part. Definitely looking forward to our discussion today because we have a star cast, an absolute star cast today to talk about Russia. And when I say that, I'm not exaggerating. I know I like to praise all our speakers who we have here and say that they're the best in the world, et cetera, but this time I actually mean it. Is that what I also say every time? No. We do it very good.
We are in Europe, Sergey. It's modern American culture that's all about shameless self-promotion. So just
well, I will start with Sasha Gabuev. Also, to make it extremely confusing this time around, three of our speakers are Sashas or Alexander, and Alexandra. We also have Ekaterina, so that makes it a little bit challenging. But I will start with Alexander Gabuev on my far left.
Hi, Sergey.
Hi, Sasha. Very, very good to see you. Welcome back to SAIS Europe. You've been here before, and I really enjoy seeing you here and see our collaboration grow. Sasha Alexander Gabuev is now the head of Carnegie in Berlin. And I know, Sasha, you will be able to tell the story much better than I can, but since you don't like to promote yourself, let me talk a little bit about this story. So we're back in 2022. Putin has just ordered the invasion of Ukraine, and Carnegie Moscow, which was a think tank in Moscow, and I thought, certainly at that time was a leading producer of quality expertise on Russia, was basically shut down. Now, the director of then Moscow Center, Dmitry Trenin, went over to the dark side, but the team, who are absolutely bright, best experts, a lot of them were forced to flee Russia and ended up scattered all over Europe. And Alexander Gabuev brought them together. And they're now working there in Berlin under Carnegie. Carnegie, what's their official name? Carnegie Eurasia.
It's Russia Eurasia.
Russia Eurasia, producing some of the best expertise that we have here in Europe on Russia-related matters. Now, before his current administrative bureaucratic reincarnation, Alexander Gabuev was, and still is really, an expert on Russia-China relations. Has published a great deal on this subject, probably the leading voice on the subject of Russia-China relations today. So that's I think enough praise for Mr. Gabuev. And sitting next to him is Alexandra Prokopenko.
Prokopenko.
I always forget that, and I know you get really sensitive about this. It's like when people mispronounce my name, which happens all the time as well. Nobody knows what the hell I'm called. Right. So Alexander Prokopenko used to actually work for the Russian central bank at one stage, and is probably the leading expert on Russian economy alive today in Europe. She regularly produced some of the best expertise on the state of the Russian economy, including actually she had a recent article in Foreign Affairs, which was absolutely brilliant. So great stuff there. So we've got the economic angle covered there. Sitting next to Sasha is the other Sasha,
yes.
Sasha BAUNOV, who's by the way, of course, I forgot to say about Sasha Prokopenko is that she's also at Carnegie Berlin, and of course, so is Sasha BAUNOV, who is also, however, at the European University in Florence. And is a well-known author and publicist in Russia, has just actually published an absolute bestseller in Russia that has been selling like hot.
Like a popular novel.
Like a popular novel, even better. Better than Harry Potter. You would not believe what the Russians are buying now better than Harry Potter. The book is called The End of the Regime, and it's not even the end of the Russian regime. It's the end of other autocratic regimes in Europe, namely Spain's Franco, Salazar in Portugal, and the Greek colonels. So that is very, very interesting. And sitting right next to me here, we have Ekaterina Szulman, who is a political scientist, also now affiliated with Carnegie in Berlin, but also with presently, certainly since you've been forced to flee Russia, with the university in Kazakhstan, I believe. A leading political scientist in Russia, and widely known for her study of autocracies, various types of autocracies in Russia, and also the Russian legal system. But also an absolute superstar.
A future Russian president.
Has more than 1 million subscribers on YouTube. And are we in the baby kissing station? So sort of coming close to an absolute superstar in terms of her political influence in Russia. I mean, she speaks to a wide audience of Russians who think, the thinking Russians, who are, of course, her audience. We're very pleased and honored to have her here with us, as well as the other speakers. So, okay, I think I've done my dues here. And we can enter straight into our conversation. But this is what I want it to be. I want it to be a conversation and not a lecture. So I will start us off with a couple of questions, really. And then I want to open the floor, and we will have a proper discussion, hopefully moderated by me, although I'm not such a great moderator, but I'll try my best. So think of questions that you want to ask. And I think I will start by asking the first question. I would like to start with Sasha Prokopenko, and I would like to ask you, based on your reading of the current situation in Russia, and you've looked at the economic performance, you argue in your various recent publications that Russia is actually not doing particularly badly. However, there are also serious problems. What is your reading of the economic situation in Russia today? Is Russia really doing as well as Putin claims in his various boasts? Has Russia been able to kind of bounce back from sanctions post-invasion of Ukraine? Does it have long-term resilience? Could you reflect, please, very briefly on this question? Thank you.
Thanks, Sergey. So, well, basically the current debate around Russian economy are usually go near the binary opposition. On the one hand, there is that sanctions are working and they will kill Russian economy probably tomorrow or maybe the day after tomorrow. And on the opposite side is sanctions are not working, Putin wins, and we need to get used to that. The reality is much more complex and boring. So Russian economy in 2023 grew much more. So the Russian economic growth was much more extensive than expected, than anticipated by most forecasters in the world, and basically in Russia, it's approximately 3.5%, maybe a little bit more after Rosstat will do the final calculations, but it is not important. So it is bigger than the economic growth in Germany, which is, I think, going to fall down into recession. Then it's much more in terms of economic growth. It's bigger than the economy of the UK. But if we will think about this growth in terms of people's well-being, we always need to keep in mind that there is nothing in common with people's well-being and well, basically, the purpose of economic growth is that people who lives in the country will live better, will get more, will earn more, can buy more different goods from the money they earned. It's not about what we're talking in Russia. And so three components of Putin's economic growth is first and foremost high expenses, especially on military industry complex. Russia spent approximately 5% of GDP in 2023, and expenses on military will exceed, on my estimates, 8% of GDP in 2024. It is enormous, and it's the biggest figure of military expenses in modern Russian history since the beginning of Russia in 90s. The second pillar of Russian economic growth is high revenues of oil and gas, thanks first to China and India, but also Turkey is here and some Eastern European countries who are still benefits from cheap oil, from cheap Russian oil. And as well as subsidized loans for corporate and people within Russia. So it is they fulfills the internal demand, also a very important component of economic growth. And here is also lack of enforcement of Western sanctions, and which are basically which we basically see not only from the countries of so-called global south, but also European countries. European companies are still doing business, continuing business with Russia, and there are lots of proxy jurisdictions, dozens of firms, entities established in countries like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Turkey, in United Arab Emirates, which helps Russia to circumvent sanctions. There is also a tolerance to inflation from Russian authorities, mostly from economic bloc of the government and partly from Russian people. The inflation compared to European one is quite high, but Russian people witnessed double-digit inflation during latest history multiple times. So 7.4, I think it was the latest figures from forecast. Well, the annualized year inflation is quite higher. It would be approximately 12.6, but it's still tolerated by people. So these are major components of Russian economic growth. And speaking of sustainability, in the short term, yes, Russian economy is sustainable, and Putin has money to finance the war in 2024, and I think in 2025. Is this so current equilibrium, I can say that it's negative. Speaking of midterm and long term, Vladimir Putin now faces so-called impossible trilemma. So he need to continue to finance the war. Then he needs to maintain the facade of business as usual agreement with his population and maintain safeguarding macroeconomic stability. Achieving first and second goal requires higher costs, which means high inflation. And this is not compatible. That's not get along with macroeconomic stability. And macroeconomic stability requires control on spending. So the first and the second goals are not achievable, which basically brings us to the point that I think at the end of 2024 and in 2025, Putin will need to make the trade-offs he need to make would be much more tougher, and life of Russian people would be less easier than it now, but in terms of sustainability, it's still sustainable if nothing happens. I mean, nothing like Russian sanctions successfully isolated Russian economy from most of the global shocks, and there is only one channel remained, and that is oil prices. And so if we wouldn't witness the decrease of oil prices for a long time, for 6 months, they will go before $60 per barrel, that would be painful for Russian economy, but no one anticipates such dynamics. So unfortunately, Russian economy is a big animal. It wouldn't fold. It wasn't it wasn't killed by sanctions. it is sustainable in the short term, and on a long term, it means the current situation means that life of ordinary Russians will get worse, but not bad enough, so people will raise and do riots and, I don't know, overthrow government. So yeah, this is the reality we live. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha. That's a real tour de force. And of course, Russia is not particularly known for popular revolutions from below. It's just, does it happen? Has it happened? Has it happened? Maybe, Ekaterina, maybe turn to you. Okay, let's turn to you then now, and maybe you can reflect. I've heard you recently also talk about the state of the Russian political elite, and that some of the people that have kind of the core that has formed around Putin has started to dissolve itself to a certain extent. Maybe you could also reflect on that.
Thank you, Sergey. And I can add a couple of points to what Alexandra has been saying. I'm not an economist, but I've been reading the federal budget bill. And we have, during recent years, the 3 years budgetary planning. So we have a federal budget for 2024 and plans for 2025 and 2026. And what struck me is the difference between 2024 and the 2 succeeding years, according to the plans of the Minister of Finance, the ministry that is responsible for drafting the federal budget bill. In 2024, we have a sharp increase both in spending and revenues, which is natural, first because the war expenses need to be ramped up, and 2024 also happens to be the electoral year, and elections in autocracies are specific. They are different from democratic elections, but nonetheless, they're extremely important to the system, and it means that money ought to be spent on the election process per se, and also on handing out gingerbread and carrots to the electorate. So in one sense, it's natural, this uprise of both revenues and spendings. But what is interesting is that, according to Minfin, starting 2025, the budgetary figures ought to kind of come back to normal. This normal is not pre-2022 normal, but they are pre-2024 normal, which kind of looks like a message that we have stamina and resources for another year of this, and even for a little bit of escalation, given the sharp rise of military spending. But it is only for 2024. And after that, we need to somehow moderate this gala festival that we've been indulging in. I have heard, and again, I'm no economist, that the rate of taking money out of the Fund of National Welfare, if continued at the same rate, will empty it during 2024. So there, again, we have the same 1 year span, which is interesting because one of the more popular bits of Kremlin discourse that's been assimilated also in the West is that Russia has all the time in the world. Russia has all the resources it needs and more. People have adapted themselves to the war situation. The system has adapted itself to the war situation. So Russia can go on at this rate as long as it takes, as long as necessary. While there's the same story, Western countries, the democratic countries, are tied to their electoral calendars. Therefore, they don't have the time, they don't have patience, they have fatigue, etc. I am always suspicious of, propaganda trends and their acceptance, their assimilation. Russia is tied to its own electoral calendar as well, which is demonstrated, among other things, in the budgetary spending figures. And I'm not quite sure that this adaptation has been going, well, it has been going well enough, but I'm not sure how long can it last. Alexandra has mentioned inflation. She said that Russians are used to inflation. They have seen double digits in the 90s, which is all absolutely true. But if you have seen something in the past, it doesn't mean that you are happy to see it again. And if you are used to it, it doesn't mean that you like it. Again, I'm not predicting a mass riot in any sense. Russia is not a democracy. It is what is called a solidified, rather repressive, personalist autocracy, according to its regime type. And such political models are not usually overthrown by mass protests. They weaken from the inside. And this brings us back to your initial question about the state of the elites. Again, this story, the popular story goes that elites got used to war, they benefit from it, they make money from it. So not only are they happy in their current position, they can no longer imagine a non-war state of affairs. The popular phrase is that Putin's regime cannot stop the war because war is now its raison d'etre, its customary existence. Again, I'm wondering if it's completely true. Russia has been sustained by its partially effective bureaucracy. It is also a big animal. As well as Russian economy, Russian bureaucratic machine is a large one. It consists of hundreds of thousands of people practically involved in the business of governing and administrating the country. Most of these people are civilians, the civic bureaucracy. And the civic part of it has been much more effective during both 2022 and 2023 than either the army or the secret services and law enforcement. These people, the so-called technocrats, at least part of them, identify themselves as technocrats, as far as we can judge, have begun to look upon themselves as a kind of saviors of the country. They have kept the system running. They have withstood the sanctions and other challenges of the war. And by the way, when we talk about what is happening to Russian economy, we tend, especially here in the West, to think mainly of the sanctions. But sanctions is not the only thing that is happening. War is the main thing that is happening. Therefore, war spending, and therefore another thing that is putting great pressure on the system, labor market crisis. Or to put it more simply, the lack of people to actually work. I can talk a bit about it later because it's also a kind of multifaceted crisis, which, as crises usually do, consists of various elements that have coincided in the same point of time, a kind of perfect storm. But coming back to the technocrats. So these are the people from the financial economic bloc of the government and the ministries and their regional branches. And these are the people from the regional and local administrations. So they've been working under huge pressure and under constant risk. Because being civilians, they are almost as defenseless before the Siloviki community as an ordinary Russian is. For example, the mayors of Russian cities are among the most often criminally prosecuted professional groups ever. The chances for a mayor to end up his career in prison, or at least under arrest, is equal to the other most popular career road of coming up to work in the regional administration. So these people have been, and I don't mean here specifically mayors, but rather the financial economic people, they've been sustaining themselves with the idea that since they have saved the country in their own estimation, they have remained both loyal and efficient. And the president, of course, goes the story, knows that. They will be rewarded after the elections. And of course, the post-election period is the most natural time for a little bit of personnel reshuffle, which is, in the eyes of many, long overdue, because the Russian system is extremely conservative, and it has remained conservative during the 2 war years. Quite unusually, this war has not been a career lift for anyone. The system has prevented the appearance of popular generals, which usually happens when you have a war. It has also successfully prevented, so far, the army from becoming a political actor. It's been a political tradition in Russia since the end of the World War II that political police and secret services in general are political actors, but the army and navy is not. Again, we will not go into details here why Stalin did this, fearing the popularity of Marshal Zhukov, etc. But tradition has kept, and it is still being kept. So no personnel changes, no new people, even no high-profile intra-elite repression cases. We have the endings of the big criminal cases that began 3, 4, 5 years ago. They make headlines, especially when people get 19 years of penal colony, etc. But we have no new cases, and no new repressive cases means no vacancies. So what the technocrats and other bureaucrats are thinking is this: after the elections, all this will change. The president will recognize our selfless efforts to save the country, and we will be rewarded in some way. We will be promoted. New people, younger people will, I don't know, head regions, Russia's regions, or somebody will become prime minister. And of course, by a domino effect, other people will also rise proportionally. In this way, they, as I said, are sustaining themselves in their rather cheerless existence, which is not just laborious, but also highly risky. What if nothing of this kind happens? And I rather suspect it will not happen. Again, the system is conservative. The top political leadership consists of 70 plus people who've been together for 25 years and more. The president never liked new faces that much, and he's liking them less and less. You can't get rid of these old-timers because there's always a story that somebody like Minister Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is begging to retire but is not allowed to. I'm not sure this is true, but the truth is the president doesn't like people leaving. You have to invent some story of an illness. It's told that cancer goes off best in order to be allowed to leave. And it's been worse, of course, since the beginning of the war, because stepping down means retirement, and retirement means comparative freedom. And there's always a suspicion that this or that person will leave the country, which is now tantamount to state treason. So to sum up, what I want to actually point your attention to is that this whole adaptation story is only partially true. The system is under the strain. It has the stamina, I think, barring external shocks, like what Alexandra mentioned, lower oil and gas prices, or somebody's sudden death, or some major setback on the front line, or a series of infrastructural catastrophes like the one we've seen in Russian regions in the beginning of January. Repeated. So barring that, it has the stamina for one more year, but I would doubt that this adaptation really allows it to go on forever or for 5 years, 8 years, or 10 years at this rate.
So the glass is half full, you think? You're an optimist, which is rare.
Well, I don't know if it's optimism or pessimism. It depends on what exactly you want and how do you imagine the.
We know the joke about the optimist. And
yeah, and about the glass. Yes, of course, of course. I think our glass is rather 1/3 full, which is a lot. But I don't know if we're going to get any more water or whatever is in this glass.
Backwash.
We were lucky if it's not a glass of blood.
Well, okay, thank you. That was really interesting to get your insights. And I completely agree with you, by the way, on this point. A lot of people in the West, I think, have a misunderstanding of the contemporary Russian political context, which I have to, we all know that it's pretty dire, it's awful. It's not Stalinism, because in the Stalinist repressions in the late 1930s, thousands and thousands of people were killed, were sent into the camps, were killed, and the
And it
people
was a
like people
great
like
career life
yeah, it was a career life for people
for
like
millions.
Kosygin, Khrushchev, all of those people. That's how they came up, right? Through Stalinist repressions, not to be repeated. For this is terrible. But the interesting thing is, a lot of people kind of today think of Putin as almost a Stalin, whereas Putin, in some ways, in terms of cadre stability, looks more like Brezhnev than Stalin. Certainly, you could make that argument. Or perhaps, and here maybe I'm looking at Sasha Gabuev on the other end of the table, who's been omitted so far. Would you like to come in on any of these questions? I mean, you've looked at the Russian economy. You understand the struggle that's going on in the Russian elites. Do you think that? I mean, what is the estimate there in the Kremlin, in your opinion? Is the idea to basically go on with this war for another year to see if it can be won? And of course, judging by the situation in Ukraine, things are very unstable. I don't know if you've seen the news just today. Zelensky has just let go of Zaluzhny.
That's not confirmed yet.
Is it not confirmed yet?
No.
But that if this turns out to be true, that this is a major development. Of course, that also reflects on certain things happening in Ukraine. Do you think Putin has a reason to be optimistic about the way Ukraine is going, or the war in Ukraine is going?
I just throw a couple of very quick points, and I think that in order to do the diagnosis of the regime, we should turn to the author of the book. Again, it's a bestseller that doesn't mention Putin once, but it's the most popular book in Russia in a very particular year. Quite remarkable. First, I think that
it's denying.
yeah,
Okay.
the ministry says, like, to all of the journalists, that this is not truth, without saying what is not truth. We'll see.
Okay. Well, we'll have to look and see.
I would say that with all of the nuanced and mixed picture that Ekaterina and Alexandra have portrayed, and the fact that we cannot know the future, we would agree that the situation is manageable for the Kremlin. And time and again over this 2 years, we've seen wild hopes pinned on something like, oh, there's going to be a Prigozhin revolt and maybe this guy will fix Vladimir Putin's problem. Oh, the Russians are stupid orcs, they cannot adapt on the battlefield, so maybe Ukrainians will just wipe them out very quickly, and then they will take care of our Putin problem. Oh, there will be this Atacam missile or Storm Shadow or so on, like this Wunderwaffe that will fix Vladimir Putin problem, or we'll apply 13th package of sanction and it will finally kill the beast. And it's not, because the system is pretty resilient, big, and adaptive. And yes, Mr. Putin made a lot of fatal mistakes, but as Ekaterina and Alexandra pointed out, parts of his state machinery are run by, unfortunately, very competent people, right? So on that scale, there are a lot of unpredictability, but I think that basic parameters suggest that absent major unpredictable developments, this can carry on. The second part, what's happening on the battlefield and in the war, is also dependent on 3 more actors in very big terms. And it's really dynamics. So we know more or less what's happening on the Russian side. Then Ukrainian side, I think, matters a lot. And here, the news that you just quoted, the public squabbling between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny before that, the stream of news that is coming from Ukraine is really not encouraging. And I don't think that you have any Ukrainian on the panel, you have any Ukrainian passport holder, so we shouldn't comment on this. But I think that based on what we know from our colleagues in Ukrainian Initiative and based on every piece of research that is produced, is that the situation is pretty precarious. Ukraine is a vibrant democracy, even at times of war. It's a society that has culture of discussions and disagreement, and the consensus that was there throughout the first 18 months of Russian invasion, and the agreement on not talk up the problems in order not to discourage the population, and not to discourage the allies, and not to make the enemies happy, is disappearing because you see obvious problems in the strategy. And people and various actors say, we need to talk about this, Mr. President. Like, if the strategy is not working, let's discuss what our approach should be. And when established politicians like Yulia Tymoshenko, with like huge baggage, not somebody who is trusted, but somebody who is established and is a player, says, Mr. President, I beg you to think about Plan B and present Plan B to the society, something is up. And then all of the figures. So I think that this is a piece of the mosaic that is worrisome and that matters for the outcome. That's one. Two, we see what's happening with the Western support of Ukraine. And it's a drama with, unfortunately, an unpredictable outcome. Because I think end of last year, somebody we know and respect with a lot of access in Washington, like an American colleague of ours, came over to Berlin and told us, rest assured, the package is coming. By Christmas, it will be there. Like, we've spoken to people at the Pentagon, on the Hill, and so on. It's all political squabbling. It will be over. It's more than a month since Christmas, right? And the package is not there. And the news cycle is getting into another direction. So we all hope, fingers crossed, that this will be a package, but we don't know. Without an aid package on the US side, it's something very material. It's not just money, but it's also the mandate to finance a lot of vital stuff that no other party can provide to Ukraine.
It's the symbolism as well that is important.
It's a symbolism as well, but it's also money that pays for some really vital stuff that
right.
no other party
Europeans,
can pay.
yeah.
Right? European money is important. And then very final point here, what happens to the outside support or cooperation that Russia gets? Will others be distancing themselves from Russia or not?
Do you mean
China,
and others?
India,
Yeah. The global
the
south?
Gulf,
And
and
of course,
so on?
China is the one that matters in this context more than anybody else.
I think that many other matter, but China matters most. And so far, last year, we've seen growth of trade of roughly 35%. We see that the stream of critical
$200 billion.
components, right, $240 billion.
Is it 240?
$240 billion.
Yeah.
And it's set to grow.
And of course, it's very interesting. The Chinese, unlike their early peace initiatives and whatnot, have not taken interest in any of the Zelensky, even meeting Zelensky at this point, as we saw from the recent meeting in Davos.
Try to put yourself in their position. The peace formula of Zelensky is, point one, we will start negotiations with Russia once Russians vacate internationally recognized territory of Ukraine border 1991. And then that's when we start talking. And then we're going to talk about two things and some other things. But two things is how we're going to persecute war criminals, including Mr. Putin.
In restitution.
And we're going to talk about Russia paying for the damage. And then we also going to talk about security guarantees for Ukraine and so on. So basically, it's a formula for Russia's unconditional surrender.
Yep.
Chinese don't see any material support for that on the battlefield. Like, why would Mr. Putin say, okay, I'm lost. I look at the wrong map. I'm flying to The Hague and bringing all of the war criminals with me, right? And then we're going to talk who is paying for the flight.
The Chinese are practical people.
Right. So why? And then the subject, the core of the proposal is not changing. So if you try to put yourself in Yermak's shoes, who is kind of the major driver of this, of course, you want to keep the story in the news cycle and you want to show that the level of participation is growing up and the number of participants is growing. But what's framed as discussion of Zelensky peace formula is basically tireless promotion of that without adaptation. Yep. Chinese came to Jeddah because Saudi Arabia asked them to, and they figure out that it's not adapting. So you're going to elevate, and at some point, the idea is that you have all the world leaders, including Xi Jinping, standing around President Zelensky. President Zelensky, again, delivers his 10 points, and then they say, ha, and Putin was not invited, and everybody is around, so now you need to surrender Vladimir Putin. Why would Xi Jinping do that? It's absolutely an embarrassing proposition for him.
You put yourself in
Xi Jinping's
shoes, you would not do that.
They're not doing that. They did it once because the Saudis asked them. They've never showed up to anything else. And unless there is a more creative solution on how to bring them on board, and the Chinese, as you know, all the time asking, okay, what's there for us? You want us to help on Vladimir Putin, maybe the sanctions on Huawei and like the executive order from October 2022 should go away, right? If we prove to be a good guy. And then Americans say, no, it's compartmentalized. Like you being a terrible monster and so on is a separate thing from us willing you to help to fix Mr. Putin problem. And by the way, there are the Houthis, and you're a big friend of Iran. So tell them to stop disrupting international trade because it's your interest as well. Unless that goes away and there is a give and take in non-compartmentalized setting, why aren't Chinese interested in being part of that?
Good
Trying to
question.
help them.
Okay, just to sort of finalize our opening remarks. I know they've kind of dragged out because we have so many people on the panel, but I would like to turn now to Sasha BAUNOV with a simple question: how does it end? When you've written a book on the end of such regime as Mr. Putin's, what can we say? How long can Putin maintain his grip on Russia? Does he have legitimacy among the Russian people? What's your answer to this?
We are all too deep in our knowledge of details, so maybe for a foreign audience, it makes sense to make several steps behind and to see what's going on in more general way. I'm sometimes asked, what's the problem with the war? Yes, it's an unjust war, maybe unjust war, but the United States are or were waging many unjust wars. So what's the problem with this one? One of the biggest differences is that you cannot be against this unjust war where you are inside the country. You are just banned, forbidden, criminalized, and prosecuted if you are talking, going out on the street, or writing against this war.
So can I just add? I just want
to.
And
what I was trying to add that when presenting us, you forgot to mention that four present people are declared foreign agent with an official label, and
this is important. I wanted to mention then this. I forgot. We have 3 foreign agents here
in
on
the audience of 4. Which is a record.
Yes, it's yes,
and an employee of undesirable organization
and a representative of undesirable. I'm the only clean person as far as the Russians say, which is very suspicious.
Clean yet.
Okay. When I complained to my colleagues here that I was not a foreign agent as far as Russia is concerned, they said that this was because I was not Russian enough. But I think the real reason is that I'm not important enough for them. So, please continue.
The real reason is you are writing mostly in English when you are writing in Russian. So for a larger Russian audience, you are more dangerous for the regime. And this is the presence of 3 foreign agents among 3 foreign agents and the member of one undesirable organization here on the panel is a sign that the nature of the regime has been changed recently after the beginning of the invasion. Again, the other question I hear often in the foreign audiences is what the problem? Putin, Russia was a dictatorship before the war, it's dictatorship now. What's the difference? The difference is this, that the war is several processes that are running simultaneously. It's war itself. It can be divided in different parts too, like getting territories, getting a part of Russian population back to the Russian people, the upheaval, the global upheaval for the juster world order as it put by the Kremlin spokespersons. But inside the country, it's a sort of domestic, internal coup d'etat. The regime changed without changing the head. And if you see the history of the long-standing dictatorships, of the long-standing authoritarian regimes, you see many examples of this, of both degradation of a dictatorship that was mostly or partially rational before, to a full-scale dictatorship, or the so-called thaw yeah, we are, I don't know, it's a political term. So sort of liberalization of the regime with the same ruler or with the same party in leading the country. We have a clear degradation of the regime. The law of foreign agents was adopted in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Katya, 14 закон об иноагентах. 2013, immediately after Putin's return to the Kremlin, but it started massively being implemented last fall. No, not last fall, the fall of 2021, exactly before the war. We can say that it's very strange type of the domestic coup d'etat, because most of the high-ranking officials are on their places, but their behavior, their practices, their words, and you are very happy not, and those of you who are not reading Russian fluently, you are very happy of not reading and hearing what the Russian officials are saying and writing now, what type of language they are using, because it's very extreme, harsh, Bolshevik style, Nazi style language. Not only Medvedev is a singular case, but we are going to the members of the parliament, we are going to Volodin, who is head of the Duma, the lower chamber of the parliament, and so many of them. You are happy not to hear what is said the Russian official in the Russian official TV, and we don't have any other official. So before the war, it was a sort of authoritarianism of I don't know, development led by a more or less rational leader who cared a lot about the remnants of the democratic institutions, of the disguise of this facade of the democratic institutions, with many pockets of the free speech, the possibility of civic discontent, the possibility of taking on the streets for those who are against some particular decisions. After that, it became totally impossible. It's a totally different type of regime. The question about the future is, I don't have a happy, an optimist, as you say, as you put it, answer. It's not completely pessimist, but I don't have any optimist answer too. We had many cases of democratization of such type of the regimes during the 20th century and before, and the number of democracies is constantly increasing. Don't maybe listen to those who are talking about the revenge of the autocracies we are watching right now. On the longer term, on the longer space, on the longer term, you see that the number of democracies is increasing. But the most successful democratization, conscious democratizations or democratizations by mistake, which is a major number of democratizations during the 20th century, has happened in the countries which were, we can say, re-democratized, that had more or less strong democratic and parliamentary tradition, and where general, as Spain was, and Portugal was, and Greece was, and Turkey was, and Pakistan, and what else, a part of, in general sense, a part of the Western world, or at least the part of the Western security camp. If we are going to the regimes strongly opposing the West, that were in no sense a part of the Western system of security, like Iran or North Korea or Cuba or Russia now, the things become more complicated, unfortunately.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for that. Let's open the floor to questions. We've got about half an hour, maybe just a little bit more, about half an hour to discuss this various things. So if you have a question, raise your hand, introduce yourself, and yep. Somebody.
Hello. Hello, thank you very much for the discussion. It's been very informative. I'm Harrison Quinn. I'm a first-year Meyer student, and my question's for Ms. Schulman. You mentioned that the civic bureaucracy has pretty strong incentives to support Putin during the election because of their class insecurity. And I was wondering, putting forward the best hypothetical, if Putin were to somehow exit power, how do you think that the civic bureaucracy as it exists now would contrast in maintaining the autocratic system in comparison with like the Siloviki? So would they be inclined to continue supporting the status quo even absent this leader? And how would this maybe compare with the group that has a bit more stable power? Thank you.
Ekaterina, let's have another question. I think we've got Oscar over there. Can we? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting session. I wanted to ask all of you about mostly Prigozhin and the Wagner, let's say, rebellion or attempt against the Ministry of Defense. I wanted to ask your opinion on how did like the average Russian population, civilians, saw this? Did they see it, and can we actually consider this a bit, as most of you claim, that there are cracks in the system within perhaps the leadership and the elites? Because in my opinion, of course, Prigozhin was very close to Putin, and he of course he rebelled against some of his subordinates. That I guess can be a hint that there are some cracks within the Putin regime. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Daria Lange. I'm a first-year Maya student. My question also relates to you, Mrs. Schumann. You talked about the technocrats, and in general, I was wondering, because my understanding is in the population that they're still in support of the war in Ukraine, whether that's because of ideology or whatever. It's obviously hard to tell. I was wondering if you have a feel on how the bureaucracy feels about the war in Ukraine, because you mentioned they see themselves as kind of saviors, but I'm wondering whether you think that they also ideologically support the war. Thank you.
Regarding the first question about civic bureaucracy, maintaining stability in a post-Putin period, that's a absolutely brilliant question. I have just written an article about that for Carnegie. It's in English and in Russian. And in the end of this article, I ask this very question: what will happen to an apparatus of a personalist autocracy without the person? Whether it will continue to be this maybe one of the few stable institutions Russia boasts, or whether it will be paralyzed in the absence of the leader who gives orders. And like an honest expert that I aspire to be, I say that we don't know. But it is, I think, one of the key questions ever. We are talking a lot, and reasonably so, about the disinstitutionalization of Russian political model, which is absolutely true. Many, if not most, of our political institutions are either fake or just absent and non-existent. We don't have a real parliament or real political parties. Elections play a specific role, but they're not real elections. We don't have a court system. We don't have a lot of things. But we do have a bureaucracy and this even more generalized thing called nomenclatura, which I hope is a term you are familiar with, and which is the thing that has been carrying on since Peter I till the present day in a rather sustainable way. So being a former bureaucrat myself, I rather tend to put my trust in bureaucracy. I think that at this current stage of our political evolution that Alexandra has mentioned, then we are not governed by a very rational leader, not in the sense that he's gone crazy, but his decision-making process has become peculiar. I wouldn't agree that it's a different regime. It is the same regime, and that's one of the sources of the tension, because it's the same regime trying to do different things it is not adapted to and is not very good at, like waging a full-scale war with a neighbor. But I think that at this current stage, the leader, who rather symbolizes the system and provided and continues partially to provide very important functions for the system, is rather a source of chaos and unpredictability than the opposite. He has been an stability epitomized, a kind of god of stability, like Athena is a god of wisdom. So Putin stands for stability. But starting 2020, not even 2022, he has come up with a series of decisions which are, to put it mildly, weird. And because we are in an autocracy, and in a personalized autocracy which lacks any system of checks and balances, when these weird decisions appear, there is no one to say no, to object, to even offer a plan B or an alternative variant. What the system does is to adapt. And in this sense, Russian bureaucracy, even the highest bureaucracy, is very much part of Russian society. Governed by the same universal Russian slogan, nothing depends on us. От нас ничего не зависит. We should really write these words on our national flag, because this is what everyone is saying to himself or herself, from lowest to the highest. I think the Minister of Defense thinks the same thing. Well, what can I do? I can only make things worse for myself, but I can't change anything.
But Ekaterina, is it the bureaucracy or is it the people? Because the people, you know, if you talk about the society at large, this is the society, and nothing depends on us.
Mm-hmm. And
it's not just
bureaucracy, they're not aliens. They belong to the same society. That's my whole point. And it is kind of tragic because a lot depends on them, and even a lot depends on the people. But it has been one of the tasks of an autocracy to atomize society and to convince both the people and the ruling class that they have no choice. They have no options. They adapt. They always adapt. They are good at adapting. We have described that in some detail. So my personal supposition, my working theory at this moment, is that what bureaucracy is doing is softening the blows delivered by the president to the system itself. And it is doing rather well, although I think its resources are, if not running out sounds dramatic. It gives one an idea of a kind of sand clock, but it has difficulties. I think that if the leader disappears, my likeliest scenario is the March the 5th, 1953, death of Stalin. So what happened then exactly? The members of Politburo gathered over the body of the leader of the people and made a couple of decisions. First, they have chosen one of their own, the person who seemed to them most harmless, first Malenkov and then Khrushchev, to be a nominal leader. Second, they have chosen one of them to be the villain and shot him. And third, they have decided that they are no longer going to kill each other or allow them, the elite members, to be physically exterminated, like it happened under Stalin. And this agreement holds to this day. Soviet regime survived the death of the father of the people, but Soviet regime changed irrevocably. Stalin's times never came back. Stalinist practices went away, which did not make the Soviet regime into something very liberal and very democratic, but to deny the difference is pointless. Before March the 5th and after March the 5th, It's two different countries, although it's still a totalitarian ideological regime ruled by a ruling party guided by this totalitarian ideology. So my idea is that if Putin disappears, this collective bureaucracy may actually breathe a sign of relief, in a sense that this source of unpredictability, this leader whom you cannot object to, whom you have to obey, and who at any moment can come up with any sort of wild idea, is no more. Maybe it will happen the other way. Maybe indeed defragmentation will start in the absence of the center of decisions. Maybe the system got so accustomed to this one person that once he goes, it will be paralyzed into not making any decisions at all. We have seen something of this kind. Well, quite a couple of times. During Prigozhin's mutiny, the next question, when no one was deciding on anything. And I think the only sign of support for the status quo were telegram posts of the regional governors advising the people to stay at home. So nobody much came out in defense of the beloved leader. And on a smaller scale, during the pogrom in Makhachkala airport, the Siloviki just stayed away, didn't do anything. And by the way, the FSB is responsible for security in international airport because the bodyguard belongs to the FSB. No one did anything again. So maybe we will see the same thing, only on a much larger scale after Putin goes. To add to this, one last rather ominous detail. We have recollected Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner, and I hope the colleagues will talk about that in more detail. But his was not the only private military company, just the one that loved public relations most. Regions, state corporations are encouraged and legally allowed to create their own armed brigades. Some of them look rather ridiculous, like when the governor of some Russian ethnic region goes on air with a group of 45 plus males that don't look like they're good for anything much. But in National Republic, that is not so ridiculous at all. Gazprom has a nice little private army. Rosneft has one, to the best of my knowledge. Other corporations seem to be playing this game as well. So imagine this kind of high medieval feudal situation when you have no leader, but you have a lot of armed gangs looking at each other. Maybe they will start the shooting. Maybe it will play quite in the opposite way, like to remember another historic date, 1215 in England. Remember that?
1215 in England.
Mm-hmm.
Magna Carta, the King John.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, who's going to be the King John?
Weak leader, dubious legitimacy, a lot of armed people, not just armed bandits, but occupiers in a distant land. And they had so little trust to each other that they couldn't agree where they will meet to talk about their problems. So they had to meet in an island in the middle of the river because they were sure that they will kill each other. So, and they have laid the foundations of British.
As you were describing this, I was thinking, oh my God, that sounds like Somalia in the 90s. And suddenly it's like, oh, but it's actually early medieval England.
Yes. Yeah, we all there at some point.
Right. That was unexpected. Let's go around and take people's views on whether okay, Prigozhin is now, nobody remembers Prigozhin. It seems like for a while everybody was so excited about Prigozhin. You remember Prigozhin?
He was such a bundle of joy.
I mean, there were lots of that was just internet memes, man. Or obviously a horrible, brutal person, but it seems that Putin has stabilized his regime. At the time, it seemed like, well, that didn't look very good for him, but he managed to bounce back. What's your take, guys?
Well, it's interesting speaking about Prigozhin that during the mutiny, I communicated with a couple of my friends among so-called Russian elites. And being a part of society, these people, first, they were excited because finally something happening. Finally, something happening unpredictable with the, and no one knows how it ends. And I would say I felt a kind of sympathy to Prigozhin because he's still he's acting. Instead of everyone in the Russian politicum who is just watching or who are obedient to Putin or to Security Council, he made some actions.
Weren't there like articles in the West about, you know, a prominent opposition leader is going to oust Putin or something
Like something happening, something interesting, something finally we didn't expect it, but something движуха, so-called.
movement, yeah.
Movement, yeah.
Mhm.
The second, and it was also interesting that some of these people clean the weapons they have at their disposal and their mansions because they said, you know who are coming here. They're all prisoners. They're absolutely outlaws, and I'm ready with the gun to fight for my premises, to fight for my mansion, and for my property. No one went to go to defend Moscow, to defend Muscovites, to defend people, only their mansions, which I find really interesting. And the third with Prigozhin was very interesting how Putin reacted and the way how he communicated with the society, with the system, with Siloviks. Was to me it looked like a band-aid politics that no one have any idea what's going on here, and everyone waited for Putin, who will come and who will say what's actually going on, and then the system adjusted to his vision. So Siloviks, who done absolutely nothing, were named that they were heroes and they've done their best. And still the big question what they've done. Probably they didn't start shooting to each other, to Prigozhin's, to Wagnerites. And so Putin repeatedly called them heroes for doing nothing, actually. And this was so, but in terms of politics, I consider this as a signals to elites that, well, Siloviks are still behind my back, and I'm the leader mostly relies on them to everyone, to propaganda machine that Siloviks are heroes, so please present them to the public as the heroes. And to Prigozhin, well, it was, and then it was some sort of murky area why Prigozhin why Prigozhin saw that he can go away with that, and well, he couldn't. He was killed. I would say that. In next month, the book of my beloved friend Ilya Barabanov will come out about the true history of Wagner Group, and I already read it, and I recommend you to.
Is it in English or?
It's in first it come out in Finnish, then it will be released in Russian. I don't remember the Russian name. Probably the true history of Wagner Group. Not so poetic, I would say. So it will come out for Medusa, and in English they're still looking for some legend, for some suggestions. If you have, please, they will be very grateful. So
Ilya Barabanov is one of the best investigative journalists and reporters in Russian language. So definitely worth supporting with any text he happens to come up with.
So summing up what I've just said, it was Prigozhin's mutiny to me revealed a very interesting phenomenon of how the system is fragile, but at the same time very adjustable, and it can adjust it to any kind of situation. And probably the power of the system is that it looks like a swamp or like a dough, which And the power is in his Veskist, to remember. Who remember the word Veskist?
I don't know. Sorry.
Sorry.
Thickness.
Thickness.
I
This
think
thickness,
so.
yeah.
Yeah.
Stickiness.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Mhm. Thickness. All right. Well, look, we've got Daria. Did we cover your question? Because I did not write it down. So can you repeat it again?
No, there was a third question. It was to me and I remember.
You've got it.
But everybody said everything they wanted about Prigozhin.
Well, let's move on because we still have to. We only have just a few minutes and we need to have more questions.
Okay, I'm sorry. The question to me was about the technocrats again. Technocrats seem to interest the audience. What is their opinion about the war, right? That was the question. Well, and again, my favorite expert answer, we do not precisely know. We have difficulties finding out things about public opinion of Russian respondents generally for self-evident reasons, which I will not explain in too much detail. But there is even more difficulty in finding out about the opinions of the elites because they don't like to be questioned, and then they kind of avoid being tied to a chair and then questioned properly. So we have only circumstantial evidence. And here I would come back to my thesis that bureaucracy in general is very much part of the society. And what do we know about the society's opinion of this war? First, the single most important parameter determining your attitude towards the war is age. The older, the more supportive. The younger, the less. It's that primitive. All the other factors are secondary to this one. The second most important factor, but standing far behind the first one, is level of income. The richer, the more likely to support the war. The poorer, the less likely. And this would be understandable if we remember that if we talk about Russian middle class in just economic terms, then most of this middle class will be state servants and people working in law enforcement because they have stable incomes, relatively high salaries. They depend on the state for their well-being. They have an evident interest in supporting the status quo. But given these two parameters, there's a third. Women are less likely to support the war than the men, but age is paramount. But with all those, in all those groups, we have seen the decline of support during 2003. In the middle of 2023, we have seen on our graphs two lines crossing each other. Answer to the question, would you support, a positive answer to the question, would you support cessation of hostilities at this moment without achieving the stated goals of the special military operation? And positive answer to, and negative answer to the same question. So these two lines crossed. Before that, more people were against ceasefire or the end of the war before its objectives, its official objectives have been achieved. In July 2023, two lines crossed, the one went up, the other down. Again, this concerns all age groups. We can imagine that generally the bureaucracy will be more loyalistic than the society in general, which is a very natural thing. At the same time, civic bureaucracy, unlike the Siloviki community, the great and terrible, has benefited less from this whole thing. On the other hand, they have been killed less often than people belonging to the Siloviki. But on the third hand, and we have many hands when we talk about Russian affairs, Rosgvardia, who were the heroes Alexandra mentioned, and it's really amazing. Exactly, Rosgvardia.
That's the Russian National Guard, just for
that's the Russian National Guard, and this is the anti-riot police. And these are the armed forces that used to belong to the Ministry of the Interior, but have been cut from this ministry to form a separate entity. They have been named the main heroes. And since Prigozhin, the end of Prigozhin's revolt, they have been additionally rewarded. Again, I have a lot of juicy details here, but I won't tire you with them. So it's really the you know, it's really the case that those people who had the less to do with the whole fracas benefited the most from it, and they are not being mobilized, and they're not on the front line. So we can imagine that civic bureaucracy would rather like to see the end of this whole thing like the majority of Russian society. We can at this point state positively that the majority of Russians want the war to be over. They may understand this over in different ways. What are the stated goals and objectives of special military operation? No one exactly knows. What constitutes fulfillment of these aims and goals? Even less people are able to tell. But the main thing, the main grudge Russians have against the war, according to the polls, is its length. They can't understand why is it taking so long, and at what moment has it morphed from this special military operation that is special something done by special people in the military into a kind of full-scale war, which is to impact, as they are told, their whole lives. We can, I think, safely assume that bureaucracy thinks about the same thing.
So that's all very surprising, because here in the West, of course, we think about the Russians as these people who just want to have a war forever.
Listen to experts and try to get hold of some figures for change.
Right. Do we have time? Well, we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. So, Federico.
It's really a question for Alexandra about the oil, because I mean, we all understand that the Kremlin needs the Russian oil price to be sold at $70 per barrel in 2024, probably even 2025, 26. But how do we know how much they sell their oil for? Because if I look at the spread between Brent and Urals, for instance, I see that they risk falling below 70. Except I don't understand how much that is real or not.
Maybe one more question, anyone? We've got, okay.
I'm Master of Arts in International Relations student. I was curious if one of the panelists, I know that one of you guys mentioned the labor shortage in Russia, and I was curious how the labor shortage is impacting the Russian economy, but more so how it impacts the perception of the war, especially compared in rural communities versus urban communities. And is the labor shortage a real factor in constraining Russia's options for continuing the war? Thanks. Rural, urban, more like isolated. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's start with Alexandra.
Okay, so speaking about oil, what we see, so when Western countries introduced the price cap, the discount, so first it started to work, but so far Russian, not Russian state, but mostly Russian companies managed to deal with the price cap. So they they gathered the shadow fleet, and what we see now that the spread between Urals and Brent is shortening. And if at the beginning it was approximately from $20 to $15 per barrel, the spread, and the discount now it's 7 or 9. And probably so, and then it depends on the fluctuations of the oil price. So as I said, if the price simultaneously go below 60 just for a couple of days, for a couple of weeks even, it's not a problem for Russian budget, because it would be a problem only on a very long term. And well, 6 months is not a long term in terms of in terms of planning process, but for the budget, it would be damaging for 6 months. So if it goes for even for a while, it's not a big problem. Russian state has resources. Putin has resources in his disposal to fill the gap, the deficit. And this is National Wealth Fund. And as Katerina mentioned, Russia can run out from National Wealth Fund very shortly, but it's not the only source. I mean, so if the price goes for a while, National Wealth Fund, then domestic borrowing, and the ratio of GDP and debt ratio, it's approximately from 17 to 20%. It's extremely low. So the capacity of domestic borrowing is quite high. Then there is, I can very easily imagine the third option would be, I don't know, like when companies, state-run companies belong to military industry complex will go to Moscow Stock Exchange because population has money, and domestic market was quite popular among population, and people are not allowed now to invest on U.S. market or to European market. So because they need more tools to earn more. And to save their money from inflation, so they will put them out of their mattresses and pillows and bring to domestic market, because IPO of Kalashnikov or some other companies belong to Rostec will give them a good margin. The fourth option for Russian state can be budget cuts. And Russia is still expanding expanding spending, but not so there were no budget cuts for major expenses, so it is also an option. So I don't see, so oil is important, but not everything. And two fingers about labor shortages. Well, basically, labor shortage now is one of the big reasons behind the inflation, and Russian industry has no capacity to expand the output. If there would be some source of any external of any demand, I mean, both internal and external, Russian industry cannot expand the output. And there are three major competitors for workers now, for labor now, and one, it is military itself. So Ministry of Defense need more people to bring them to the front line, but because of the growing salaries, because of the growing wages, military industry complex now compete with the military with Ministry of Defense over these people, and civil sector is also among them, because they need to, because they're trying to force people to remain at their job with their jobs. They are raising the salaries, so it is a problem. But this problem came out not because of the war. Well, basically, the government was aware of poor demographical situation even before the war. So I don't see a lot of options how government can solve the problem. One was migration, but what we see now, the migrants flow are almost stopped, and only Tajikistan, I think, fulfilling Russia with migrants, but other countries are not, and the migrants from both from Kyrgyzia, from Uzbekistan are not so happy coming to Russia, because they are aware that they can end their life on next territories. They can easily be drafted to Russian military, and Russian labor market now are competing with labor markets in South Korea, in Gulf states, and it's not so attractive to the migrants. I will stop here.
Thank you. That's an excellent point to bring our discussion to an end. It sounds like between the two options, i.e. Russia is doing great and Russia is screwed, we have somehow, I don't think we have really established, I think we've actually treaded right in the middle between those two, right? So as always, I think that's what a nuanced discussion should be about. We're at the end of our time, so thank you all for coming to listen to this. And I look forward to continue our discussion in the days ahead. Again, thank you all for coming here, and please help me thank our speakers for their presentations.